Thanks for tuning in to CrushTheStreet.com's YouTube channel. My name is Josh and I'm one of the technical analysts at Future Money Trends. Today I'd like to talk about BREXIT, the movie, which is a documentary regarding Great Britain's involvement in the European Economic Commission. I'd like to talk about some of the great points that the film has made, as well as bring in some analysis and critique. Finally, I'd like to bring in all these things together in a broad conclusion. So, should the UK leave the European Union? When watching the film, the answer is a resounding yes. Great Britain used to be an industrial powerhouse until government regulations started putting onerous liabilities on various industries and companies. Since World War II, Great Britain has never looked the same economically, while they have been surpassed by all of its European partners. Let's face facts here. The European Union is basically affirmative action on a mass scale. What happens with the European Union is that it took some of the productivity of Great Britain and redistributed to other European partners that simply did not have the capacity to compete without this artificial help, this artificial assistance. And this is the same principle as affirmative action. It's taking productive members of society and redistributing their wealth to other members of society that may not have the desire to be productive members. BREXIT, the movie, makes it abundantly clear that government regulations, specifically the ideology of protectionism, is what killed the British economy. Protectionism works in theory. Basically, British companies and industries were sheltered from international competitors. But in practice, this created laziness among those British companies because they knew that they were being sheltered from competition. They didn't have to produce goods and services of a higher quality. Whereas international competitors, they saw that British companies were being sheltered. They knew that in order to beat the tariffs that were imposed by the British government, that the international companies and industries, they had to produce goods and services that were so competitive, that were so compelling, that British consumers were willing to pay the higher import prices to acquire those goods. And that is exactly what happened. British consumers were willing to pay higher bucks for better services, better goods, whereas British industries, British companies continued to atrophy simply because they were not willing to compete. They were being sheltered through government regulations. The ideology of protectionism works in macro scale simply because macro scales like the broader economy are too convoluted and too complicated for the average person. But let's bring it down to another example that most of us understand. What if protectionism was used in sports? Can you imagine that your favorite sports teams selected people, selected athletes based upon certain characteristics other than their performance? How badly would those teams perform? Also think about your favorite hometown team. Imagine that the league of whatever sports league that team is a part of, imagine that the league said, okay, you no longer have to compete against the other teams. You have a free road to the playoffs. Now that may sound great for that particular home team, but what ends up happening is that as soon as they get into the playoffs, that team gets pummeled because the other teams are competing against each other. They are developing their skills. The home team is basically sitting at home watching TV and not practicing and not being part of a competitive environment. So as soon as they get in to the playoffs, again, they get pummeled. Now, of course, BREXIT, the movie, is not without its faults. One of the things that I wanted to point out is that the British economy back during the Industrial Revolution, that didn't happen simply because there were no government regulations. You have to understand that this was a completely different time period. There were no such thing as the emerging markets. The emerging markets basically were still stuck in the Stone Ages. So this Industrial Revolution was basically a revolutionary paradigm shift in how business was conducted. And regulation or no regulation, that revolution would still likely have occurred. The other point that I want to address, and this is far more critical, is that regulation in and of itself is not the enemy. Rather, there should be a balance. Let's look at it this way. There are certain industries that must be regulated by the government. For example, healthcare. Imagine that you are in a car accident and that you need an immediate blood transfusion. Do you trust the free market ethos to give you that blood, or do you trust government regulation? As much as of a dirty word that government regulation sounds like, you would want government regulated blood transfusions, because if it was up to the free market, it's all about the profit incentive. So who knows, maybe that blood comes from some homeless guy on the street. You just don't know. You need regulation in certain industries. There has to be at least a balance, because going to one extreme to the other is not the answer. Look at it another way. Is constipation the answer to diarrhea? I don't think so, right? You want a regulated digestive system. Regulation is like rules in a sports game. You want competition, you want healthy competition, but that competition needs to be governed by rules. Can you imagine if you're playing a football game and one set of teams had one set of rules and another team had a different set of rules? Then it's not the football game. These are two different games. Rules create the framework of fair play and fair competition. I also felt that the film was really stretching when they tried to tie in the European Union with the rise of right-wing extremism. Right-wing extremism was caused by the imposition of multiculturalism. It really states that all cultures have moral equivalency, and that is morally incorrect. It is completely unethical to impose such an ideology. Frankly, the rise of right-wing extremism, again, in countries like Germany, cannot be explained by the European Union, because the film itself praised Germany for rising from the rubble of World War II. So obviously, the right-wing element is not wholly driven by economic concerns. It really is the rise of multiculturalism, of imposing political correctness on a people that really don't want it. The German people deserve to have a German culture, and they deserve to have a German culture forever. Just like the French country, the French people deserve to have a French culture. Every country has a right to protect its heritage, its cultural heritage, and we should not take that away due to the imposition of political correctness and multiculturalism. Overall, BREXIT, the movie, is a great documentary. It is a great film. If you have an hour, I believe this is one of the best ways to spend that hour. It'll give you an enormous history in a very quick amount of time regarding how Great Britain got itself involved, ensnared really, into the European Economic Commission. And it also tells you a lot about what has happened to the European Union, how it has turned into one giant bureaucracy that is self-policing and self-serving. Two things need to happen in the future. Number one, there needs to be a fair set of rules that fosters healthy competition. But more importantly, we need to provide companies the dignity of failure. We have seen that protectionism, all that it does is that it leads to the production of inferior goods and services. By taking away that shelter, it provides the choice to the individual company. Do you want to go to a path that leads to economic prosperity? And if so, you will have to produce superior goods and services. Or do you want to continue doing the business the same way that it's been done under protectionism? If so, you can make that choice. But we all know where that path leads.